Some stories begin with a big event. This one begins with a blue paper bird resting on a school desk. It may not sound like much, but that was how a teacher stepped into the world of a wounded little boy and ended up crossing paths with a cold, intense man, far more dangerous to her heart than he should have been. 20 small chairs, 19 of them occupied by fidgeting, chattering 6-year-olds with paint-stained fingers and untied shoes. The 20th chair sat near the window, pulled slightly away from the others, as if the boy in it had decided long ago that whatever was happening in that classroom had nothing to do with him. Oliver Crawford hadn't spoken at school in 4 months. The other children had stopped trying to include him, not out of cruelty. They were too young for that particular skill. They'd simply accepted his silence the way children accept weather. Oliver didn't talk. The sky was grey. Both just were. Brooke Dawson noticed him within 30 seconds of walking through the door. She was 29, newly transferred from a school in Bath, and this was her first morning at Aldworth Primary in the Cotswolds. The headmistress had warned her in that careful tone people use when they don't want to say too much. Oliver lost both parents 6 months ago. Car accident. His uncle has custody. We've had 3 teaching assistants try different approaches. None have gotten through. Brooke had nodded and said nothing. She'd learned early in her career that the children who needed the most were usually the ones who asked for the least. The classroom smelled of poster paint and apple juice. Construction paper cutouts of autumn leaves lined the windows. Someone had put real effort into them, probably the previous teacher trying to make the room feel warm. It did, in a way, just not for everyone. She set her bag down and scanned the room. A girl with red braids was showing her friend a drawing of what appeared to be either a horse or a very tall dog. 2 boys in the back were negotiating a crayon trade with the seriousness of stockbrokers. And by the window, Oliver sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the table, his box of coloured pencils untouched. He was small for 6, brown hair that needed cutting, falling into eyes fixed on something beyond the glass, or maybe on nothing at all. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Brooke didn't approach him right away. She spent the first hour learning names, settling disputes over seating arrangements, and reading a picture book about a badger who couldn't find his way home. The children laughed at the badger's mistakes. Oliver didn't move. During the break, while the other children tumbled out to the playground, Brooke pulled a square of blue paper from her bag. She always carried paper. Folding things calmed her hands when her mind was too full, a habit she'd picked up at university when exams made her fingers restless and a flatmate taught her the first crease. She sat down at the table next to Oliver's. Not his table, the one beside it. He didn't look at her. She said nothing. Her fingers moved through the folds with practiced ease. Valley fold, mountain fold, reverse fold. The paper crackled softly with each crease, the only sound between them, apart from the muffled shouts of children playing outside. 3 minutes later, a small blue bird sat on her palm. She placed it on the edge of Oliver's table, close enough to reach but far enough that it didn't crowd him. Then she stood, pushed in her chair, and walked back to her desk without a word. He didn't touch it, not while she was watching. But when the children filed back in and the afternoon dragged on through handwriting practice and a song about months of the year, Brooke noticed, just once, briefly, his fingers brush the wing of the paper bird. She looked away before he could catch her noticing. That evening, Brooke kicked off her shoes the moment she walked into her small rented cottage at the edge of the village. The tiles were cold under her bare feet. She filled the kettle, leaned against the counter, and pressed her thumbs into her temples. Her phone buzzed. Clara. How was the first day? Fine. Good kids. And the quiet one they told you about. Brooke thought about Oliver's hands, flat and still on the table. The way he'd looked at the window like it was a door he couldn't open. I left him an origami bird. Clara's silence lasted a full 2 seconds. Brooke, please tell me you're not already adopting a project. It's a paper bird, Clara, not an adoption form. You say that now. Next week you'll be reorganizing your entire lesson plan around one kid. They talked for another few minutes, Clara's voice sharp and warm in the way only a best friend's could be, and Brooke promised she wasn't overthinking things. She hung up, drank her tea standing by the window, and thought about the way Oliver's finger had touched that paper wing like it might bite him. The next morning, she arrived early. The classroom was empty except for the faint smell of cleaning solution and yesterday's paint. Oliver's table was clear. The bird was gone. She found it later, almost by accident, while helping him unpack his bag for the morning activity. It was in the bottom of his backpack, crumpled, bent, one wing half torn. But it was there. He hadn't thrown it away. And when Brooke walked to the front of the room to begin the day, she felt his eyes follow her, just for a moment, just long enough. It was the first time in 6 months that Oliver Crawford had looked at anyone like they might be worth seeing. The laugh came on a Thursday. Brooke had been reading to Oliver during the midday break, just the two of them in the quiet corner by the bookshelf, while the other children ate their lunches in the hall. She'd discovered, through careful trial and observation, that Oliver responded to stories about animals. Not fairy tales, not adventures with children his age. Animals. Specifically, animals who got themselves into ridiculous situations. She was halfway through a story about a hedgehog who kept trying to climb a tree and failing spectacularly when it happened. A sound, small, almost swallowed before it escaped. Oliver laughed. It was barely a laugh, really. More of a breath that had shape to it, quick, surprised, as if his own body had caught him off guard. But Brooke heard it, and the feeling that hit her chest was so sudden, so sharp, that she had to turn the page quickly and keep reading just to stop herself from looking at him. She didn't want him to see her eyes because they were full. She kept her voice steady through the rest of the story. When the bell rang, and Oliver walked back to his seat without a word, Brooke stayed by the bookshelf for an extra minute, pressing the open book against her chest, like something that needed holding. That small laugh sat inside her ribs for the rest of the day. Over the following week, the changes came slowly, but they were real. Oliver answered a yes or no question from the teaching assistant. He picked up a green pencil during art time and drew a single line on his paper, not a picture, just a line, but his hand was moving. He looked up when Brooke said his name. The school filed a progress report. Cautious language, careful optimism. Oliver is beginning to engage with select adults in the classroom environment. The report reached Anthony Crawford on a Friday afternoon. He read it in the back seat of his car, parked outside the school gates 15 minutes before the final bell. His driver waited in patient silence. Anthony read the 3 short paragraphs twice, folded the paper, and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. He told himself he was here because the school had requested a meeting with the family. That was partly true. The coordination team had sent an email, but the meeting wasn't until next week. He was early by 5 days. The school office directed him down a corridor that smelled of floor polish and hand sanitizer. Children's drawings lined the walls, bright, fearless, full of the kind of confidence only 6-year-olds possess. Anthony walked past them without stopping. He was tall enough that the corridor felt built for someone smaller. Broad shoulders, a jaw that seemed set even when relaxed, and the kind of posture that turned a school hallway into a boardroom. His dark coat was buttoned precisely. His watch, heavy, expensive, caught the fluorescent light each time his arm moved. He found her near the supply cupboard at the end of the corridor, stacking reading books onto a trolley. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbows, a smudge of green paint on her wrist, and her shoes were off, just stockinged feet on the cold tiles, as if she'd forgotten she was in a public building. "Mr. Crawford?" She straightened up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes were the kind of brown that looked almost amber when the light from the window caught them. He noticed that without meaning to. "Miss Dawson, I wanted to thank you for the report." "Of course. Oliver's made real progress this week. He's starting to—" I read it. His voice was even, polite, the kind of polite that closes doors instead of opening them. "I appreciate what you're doing." She waited for more. He didn't offer it. "He responds well to stories," she said. "Animals, mostly. He laughed this week, for the first time since he started here." "I know." 2 words. But something moved behind his eyes. Fast, deep, immediately buried. He adjusted his watch strap, turning the face half a degree to the right, and looked at the wall behind her. "If there's anything he needs," he said, "materials, resources, The school has my contact details. He doesn't need materials, Mr. Crawford. It came out before she could catch it. Not sharp, exactly, just honest. She bit her lower lip right after, the way she always did when her mouth moved faster than her judgment. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the polished glance of a man making conversation. Something deeper, something that felt like standing too close to a window in a storm. "Thank you for your time, Miss Dawson." He turned and walked back down the corridor. His footsteps were steady, evenly spaced. Not a man in a hurry. A man who had decided the conversation was over. Brooke stood there with picture books in her arms, green paint on her skin, and the unshakable sense that Anthony Crawford was carrying something far heavier than he'd ever let anyone see. 30 miles from the school, the Crawford estate sat in 3 acres of manicured grounds at the edge of a village so small it barely appeared on maps. Mrs. Whitmore had the kettle on before his car pulled into the drive. She always did. The sound of gravel under tires her only clock. She handed him the tea in the hallway. He took it without stopping, headed for his study and closed the door. But she'd seen his face. In 40 years of knowing that boy, from the toddler who hid behind his sister's legs to the man who now ran a company with 300 employees, Eleanor Whitmore had learned to read what Anthony Crawford refused to say. Something had unsettled him. Something that wasn't business, wasn't Oliver, wasn't the old grief she knew so well. She rinsed her cup, dried her hands on her apron and said nothing. But that night, long after the house had gone quiet, she noticed the light still on in his study, and through the crack beneath the door, she could hear him pacing. Eleanor Whitmore had buried a husband and raised 2 children that weren't her own. She knew what restlessness sounded like when it had a woman's face. She turned off the hallway lamp and went to bed. Some things she'd learned needed to find their own way to the surface. Oliver said her name for the first time on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the origami bird. Not to her, to Anthony. They were at breakfast, the same breakfast they had every day, in the same seats at the long kitchen table that Mrs. Whitmore set, with the same care she'd shown for 3 decades. Oliver's cereal was getting soggy. His toast was untouched. He was tracing shapes on the placemat with his fingertip when he said without looking up, "Can Miss Dawson come here?" Anthony's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. "To the house?" Oliver nodded. Small, serious, the way he did everything. "She's your teacher, Oliver. She has her own life outside of school. She reads me stories, better ones than the ones at school." A pause. "She could read here too." Anthony set down his cup, aligned the handle with the edge of the saucer, then moved the sugar bowl an inch to the left, though it had been perfectly placed to begin with. "We'll see." In Anthony Crawford's vocabulary, "we'll see" had always meant no. Oliver seemed to understand this because he went back to tracing shapes on the placemat without pressing further. But the request didn't disappear. It came again 3 days later, this time about lunch. Then about the drawings Oliver had started doing at school. Watercolor animals, clumsy but deliberate, each one better than the last. "She could see my drawings. You can bring them home and show me." "It's not the same." And then, on a quiet Sunday evening, Oliver looked up at his uncle with those eyes, dark, round, framed by lashes that belonged to someone else entirely. Anthony's chest tightened. Those were his sister's eyes. Every time the boy looked at him like that, it was like Sarah was in the room asking for something he couldn't refuse. He called the school on Monday. The arrangement was presented as educational, informal enrichment visits, the coordination team called it. A chance for Oliver's teacher to observe his home environment and support his emotional development outside the classroom. Anthony made sure there was documentation. Brooke said yes before she'd finished reading the email. Then she called Clara. "Don't say it. I haven't said anything. You're thinking it. I can hear you thinking." Clara exhaled, long, deliberate, the sound of a woman practicing patience. "I'm just going to say one thing, and then I'll shut up. Go on. Be careful not to get too involved. You're his teacher, not his family. There's a line." "I know where the line is, Clara." "Do you?" "Because last time you knew where the line was, you spent an entire summer volunteering at that children's shelter and ended up crying in my kitchen for 3 days when it closed." Brooke didn't answer, because Clara wasn't entirely wrong. "I'll be fine," she said. "It's just lunch." It wasn't just lunch. The Crawford estate announced itself slowly. First the stone wall along the lane, then the iron gate, then the gravel drive curving through old oaks whose branches met overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The house appeared at the end, large, golden-stoned, with ivy climbing the east wall, and a front door painted the deep green of something that had been maintained with pride for a very long time. Brooke parked her small car between Anthony's black Range Rover and what looked like a gardener's truck loaded with terracotta pots. She sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, and noticed she'd already kicked off her shoes. She put them back on. The door opened before she reached it. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the entrance with a smile that moved slowly across her face, the kind of smile that was warm because it was earned, not offered freely. "Miss Dawson, come in. First kettle's on." The hallway smelled of beeswax polish and fresh bread. Mrs. Whitmore led her through to a sitting room where Oliver was waiting on the carpet with his drawings spread around him like a paper kingdom. He looked up when Brooke walked in. He didn't smile, not quite, but something shifted in his face, a loosening, as if a knot behind his expression had come undone. "I drew a fox," he said, holding up a piece of paper. Brooke crouched down beside him. "That's a wonderful fox. His name is Arthur. He lives under a bridge." "Does he now?" Mrs. Whitmore brought tea on a tray, real china, not mugs, with a small plate of lemon cake cut into careful squares. Brooke noticed the older woman watching her with Oliver, not checking on her, measuring something. The garden doors were open, and through them came the sound of someone whistling badly and the rhythmic scrape of a shovel against earth. "That'll be George," Mrs. Whitmore said, setting down the tray. "The gardener. He's been here nearly as long as I have. Pay no mind to the whistling. He thinks he's musical." A burst of laughter came from outside, followed by a voice so loud it seemed to fill the garden and half the house. "Ollie, come see what I found. There's a frog in the fountain and he looks absolutely furious." Oliver was off the carpet before Brooke could blink. She followed him through the garden doors and into a landscape that made her breath catch. Roses along the south wall, a kitchen garden with herbs she could smell from 10 paces, and an enormous old oak with a wooden swing hanging from its thickest branch. Standing by the stone fountain, holding a watering can in one hand and pointing dramatically at a very small frog with the other, was a man in his 60s, with sun-browned arms, mud on his boots, and a gap-toothed grin wide enough to park a bicycle in. "Miss Dawson, is it?" George wiped his hand on his trousers and extended it. His handshake was firm and slightly earthy. "I've heard all about you. Well, I've heard what Ollie says, which isn't much, and what Mrs. Whitmore says, which is even less. But between the two of them, I've pieced together that you're some sort of miracle worker." "Hardly," Brooke said. "She made him laugh," Mrs. Whitmore said from the doorway. Quiet, matter of fact, as if she were stating the weather. George looked at Brooke with an expression that shifted from cheerful to something deeper, a softness around the eyes, a nod that said more than a speech would have. "Well then," he said, "that's something, isn't it?" From the kitchen came the smell of roasting chicken and rosemary. A woman appeared at the back door, sturdy, aproned, with flour on her cheek and a wooden spoon in her hand like a scepter. "Lunch in 20 minutes, she announced. "Oliver, go wash your hands. And George, if you track mud through my kitchen again, I'll plant you in that garden myself." George winked at Brooke. "That's Margaret, best cook in the county. Worst temper too, but we love her anyway." Oliver reached for Brooke's hand as they walked back inside. His fingers were small and cool and held on tight. She didn't let go. The visit settled into a rhythm that no one had planned. Wednesdays and Saturdays. Brooke would arrive around 11, Oliver would already be waiting by the window, and Mrs. Whitmore would have the kettle on before the car engine went quiet. It happened so naturally that by the 3rd week, Margaret had started asking Oliver what Miss Dawson liked to eat, and adjusting the menu without being told. Anthony was never there, or rather, he was always there, behind the closed door of his study on the 2nd floor, visible only as a shadow passing the window when Brooke pulled into the drive. She'd feel the weight of the house above her as she sat in the garden with Oliver, folding paper animals and reading stories, and she'd wonder if he was listening, if the window was open, if he could hear the boy's voice from up there, growing stronger each week like a radio slowly finding its signal. She didn't ask about him. That felt like crossing a line she'd drawn for herself. On the fourth Wednesday, Oliver wanted to make origami cranes. They sat on the grass near the fountain. The same fountain where the frog had long since departed, much to George's theatrical grief. Brooke showed Oliver the first fold, her fingers patient, guiding his smaller ones through each crease. Slow down. The paper doesn't like being rushed. Paper doesn't like things. Everything likes being treated gently. Oliver frowned at his crane. One wing was crooked, the tail pointing in the wrong direction entirely. He held it up with an expression so serious that Brooke had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. "It looks like it crashed," he said. "It looks like it's trying. That's more important." He considered this, then nodded. Then made another one. George appeared from behind the rose bushes, pushing a wheelbarrow full of compost and narrating his progress to no one in particular. "Now, this here is Reginald," he said, patting a shrub as he passed. "Named him after my brother. Similar shape, similar temperament, prickly but good at heart. And over there that's Lady Margaret, named after our very own kitchen queen, though she doesn't know it, and I'd appreciate you keeping that between us." Oliver looked at Brooke. The corner of his mouth twitched. That twitch was everything. The fifth visit changed things. Brooke was reading aloud in the library. A proper library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves. A leather armchair that smelled like old tobacco and thyme. Oliver was on the carpet with his head resting against her knee, his eyes half closed, his body more relaxed than she'd ever seen it. She was mid-sentence when the door opened. Anthony stood in the doorway in a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, no tie, no jacket. She'd never seen him without the armor of formality before. The shirt made him look different, younger maybe, or just more human. "Just checking everything's all right," he said. "We're fine." Brooke held up the book. Chapter 7. The hedgehog is stuck in a drain pipe. He didn't leave. He crossed the room, sat on the arm of the sofa across from them, and stayed. His arms were folded, his posture suggesting this was temporary. But he didn't move when she kept reading, and when she reached the part where the hedgehog's friends came to pull him free, she heard a low sound from his direction. Not a laugh. Almost a laugh. The ghost of one. Oliver lifted his head. "Uncle Anthony, you're here." "Just for a minute." The minute lasted 45. When Brooke finished the chapter and closed the book, she looked up and found Anthony watching his nephew with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded, raw, like a man staring at something he was terrified of losing. Then he caught her watching him, and the shutters came back down so fast she almost heard them close. He stood. "I should get back to work." "Of course." He nodded, adjusted his watch, left. But something had cracked. After that, Anthony's appearances became a pattern, one he would have denied if anyone had pointed it out. He'd show up during Saturday lunches, sitting at the far end of the table with his laptop open, pretending to work while Margaret served roast potatoes. And Oliver described his school week in the halting, careful sentences of a boy still learning to trust his own voice. He'd drift into the garden while Brooke taught Oliver to fold paper boats, standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets, watching without joining. Sometimes George would rope him into holding a watering can or steadying a trellis, and Anthony would comply with the bewildered obedience of a man who had never in his life been ordered around by someone in muddy boots. One Saturday, Brooke caught him smiling at something George said. He looked away the moment he realized she'd seen. The following Wednesday, Brooke arrived to find the library set up differently. A second armchair had been pulled close to the first, angled so that whoever sat in it could see both the reader and the boy on the carpet. Mrs. Whitmore offered no explanation. Anthony appeared 17 minutes into the reading. He sat in the new chair without comment. Oliver, without lifting his head from the carpet, reached one hand out and placed it on his uncle's shoe. They stayed like that for the rest of the chapter. Brooke kept reading, but something in her chest was doing things she couldn't quite name. The room smelled of old paper and the lavender Mrs. Whitmore kept in small sachets on the shelves. The light through the window was soft, golden, catching the edge of Anthony's jaw as he listened. She noticed for the first time a thin scar along his left eyebrow, so faint it was nearly invisible, like a sentence someone had started and never finished. She wondered how he'd gotten it. She wondered why she cared. That evening, back in her cottage, she folded 7 origami cranes in a row without realizing it. They sat on her kitchen table in a neat line, each one perfect. Clara would have said something sharp and knowing. Brooke's mother would have said nothing at all, and that nothing would have said everything. She looked at the cranes, picked up the phone, put it down, bit her lower lip. Some things weren't ready to be said out loud. Not yet, not even to herself. But her hands, folding paper in the quiet kitchen, knew something her mind hadn't caught up with. Across the valley, in the study where the light burned late, Anthony sat with a quarterly report he'd read the same paragraph of 4 times. He closed the laptop, stood, walked to the window. The garden below was dark, the roses invisible, the fountain a vague shape in the moonlight. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. The house was quieter on the night she left. He'd started noticing that. He didn't like noticing that. Margaret's roast lamb had a way of making people stay longer than they intended. Brooke had planned to leave by 4. It was nearly 6 when she finally pushed back from the dining table, full of lamb and roast vegetables, and 2 slices of Margaret's plum crumble that she hadn't meant to eat but couldn't refuse. Oliver had eaten everything on his plate, a small victory that Margaret celebrated by immediately offering a 3rd slice to everyone at the table. "I couldn't possibly," Brooke said. "Nonsense. You're all bones." Margaret set the plate down in front of her anyway. "George, tell her she needs feeding up." George, who was already on his 4th slice, pointed his spoon at Brooke. "She needs feeding up." "I'm outnumbered." "You are." "Mrs." Whitmore's voice came from the kitchen doorway, dry and warm. "Best give in now, it saves time." Anthony hadn't spoken much during lunch. He'd sat at the head of the table with the quiet authority of a man who owned everything in sight, but seemed unsure what to do with any of it when it involved sitting still and eating with people. He'd answered questions, passed dishes. Twice Brooke had caught him watching Oliver eat with something close to wonder, as if the sight of the boy using a fork with enthusiasm was a thing he'd stopped believing could happen. After lunch, Oliver fell asleep on the library sofa within minutes, a sudden total collapse, the way children sleep when their bodies decide the day is over, regardless of what anyone else thinks. George draped a blanket over him with surprising tenderness for a man who spent most of his time arguing with aphids. "Out cold," George whispered. "That lamb does it every time." The house settled into evening quiet. Margaret cleaned the kitchen with the focused silence of a woman who considered a spotless counter a form of worship. Mrs. Whitmore retired to her rooms. George disappeared toward the potting shed, muttering about a clematis that was misbehaving. Brooke should have left. Instead, she found herself on the veranda. The sun was going down over the garden, turning everything amber and gold. The roses caught the light in a way that made them look almost unreal, too beautiful, like something painted rather than grown. The air smelled of warm stone and cut grass, and the last of the day's heat rising from the gravel path. She leaned against the railing and felt her shoulders drop. Something about this house made her body forget it was supposed to be tense. The door opened behind her. Anthony stepped out with 2 glasses. "George left a bottle of cider in the kitchen. Margaret says it's been there since August." "Is it drinkable?" "Probably not, but he'll be offended if we don't try." He handed her a glass and stood beside her at the railing. Not close, a careful distance. The kind of distance a man maintains when he's aware of exactly how close he wants to be and has decided against it. They drank in silence for a moment. The cider was sharp and cold and tasted like autumn. "He ate everything today," Brooke said. "I know. That's the first time since I started coming here." Anthony nodded. He turned his glass slowly between his fingers, a deliberate motion, as if the glass were a problem that needed solving. "When Sarah was alive," he said, and then stopped. The name hung in the air between them. He rarely said it. Brooke had noticed. He referred to his sister as Oliver's mother, or as family, or not at all, but never Sarah. He started again. "She used to say that Oliver would eat anything if the right person was at the table. Not the right food, the right person." Brooke didn't respond right away. She let the sentence breathe. "He's finding his way back," she said. It takes time, but he's doing it. Because of you. She shook her head. Because of all of you. This house. George making him laugh. Margaret feeding him like he's a small army. Mrs. Whitmore knowing exactly when to appear and when to disappear. She paused. You. Me. The word came out flat, almost bitter. I gave him structure and schedules, and a routine that runs like a company. That's not what a 6-year-old needs. You gave him safety. That's the foundation for everything else. He looked at her. The sunset caught the amber in her eyes. That was the first thing he noticed. Then the way her hair had come loose during the afternoon, curling at her neck in a way that made his hand twitch at his side. Then the paint, green again, always green, still on her wrist from something she'd done with Oliver hours ago. She looked like someone who belonged in the golden light of his garden, and that thought was so dangerous he almost stepped back from it. But he didn't step back. The space between them changed. It wasn't smaller. They hadn't moved. But the air in it was different now, thicker, charged, like the moment before a storm when everything goes still and the birds stop singing. Brooke felt it in her throat first, a tightness. Then in her hands, which had gone very still around the glass. She became aware of his breathing, the slow measured rise and fall of his chest, the way his jaw tightened slightly, as if he was holding something back by force. His eyes dropped to her mouth, just for a second, but she saw it, and her breath failed. He leaned closer, slowly, not like a man acting on impulse, like a man who had been fighting an impulse for weeks and had finally run out of strength. She could smell his cologne now, something woody and clean, mixed with the evening air and the last warmth of the sun on stone. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath on her skin. "Uncle Anthony?" Oliver's voice, thick with sleep, drifted through the open door. They broke apart. It was fast, sharp, like someone had pulled a cord between them and snapped it. Anthony took 2 steps back. Brooke gripped the railing with both hands. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was sure it was audible. "Coming," Anthony called. His voice was steady, perfectly controlled. But when he turned to go inside, his hand found the railing and held it for a second longer than necessary. His knuckles were white. Brooke didn't wait. She set the glass down on the stone ledge, walked through the house, grabbed her bag from the hallway, and was in her car before anyone could say goodbye. The engine started. The gravel crunched. The gate opened. She drove 3 miles before she pulled over. Her hands were shaking. She sat in the lay-by with the engine running and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The smell of his cologne was still on her skin, or maybe she was imagining it, or maybe it didn't matter because the memory of it was enough to make her pulse refuse to slow. Nothing had happened. Everything had happened. Back at the mansion, Anthony stood in the hallway after carrying Oliver to bed. Mrs. Whitmore appeared from nowhere, the way she always did, and collected the 2 glasses from the veranda without a word. He went to his study, sat in the chair, did not open the laptop. The room was too quiet. The house was too large. The ghost of almost was louder than any sound he knew. He pressed his thumb against the face of his watch and turned it once, twice, 3 times. Neither of them slept that night. 3 stick figures, holding hands. The tallest one had dark scribbles for hair and what Oliver had clearly intended as a tie, though it looked more like a blue stripe down the middle of the body. The smallest was in the center, grinning with a mouth that took up half its face. And the third, slightly shorter than the first, with brown swirls on top and something green on the wrist, stood on the other side, her hand linked with the small ones. Beneath the drawing, in letters that leaned in different directions like passengers on a tilting bus, Oliver had written, "My family." Brooke saw it during the Friday art session. Oliver had left it on the drying rack with the others, between a painting of a rainbow and someone's ambitious attempt at a spaceship. He hadn't shown it to her, hadn't said a word about it, just placed it there and gone back to his seat. She picked it up. Her throat closed, the green on the woman's wrist. He'd noticed the paint she always had on her skin. He'd put it in the drawing. She pressed her finger to the edge of the paper and felt the slight ridge where the crayon had been pressed hard, the way children press when they mean something. She put the drawing back on the rack, turned away, blinked until her vision cleared. What she didn't see was the man standing in the hallway. David Harding had come to collect his daughter early for a dental appointment. He'd glanced through the classroom window on his way to the office, noticed the drawing on the rack, and paused long enough to read what was written underneath. He knew Oliver Crawford. Everyone in the village knew the Crawford family, the accident, the uncle, the silent boy. And now the teacher who'd been spending her Wednesdays and Saturdays at the Crawford estate. He said nothing that afternoon, but on Monday morning, an email landed in the headmistress's inbox. Mrs. Ellis read it twice. Then she called the coordination team. Then she called Brooke. The meeting was held in the small office behind the main hall, the one with the window that didn't open properly, and the motivational poster about teamwork that had been peeling at one corner since before Brooke arrived. Mrs. Ellis sat behind the desk with her hands folded. She was a careful woman, fair mostly, but careful above all. "Our parent has raised concerns about the nature of your involvement with the Crawford family," she said. "Specifically, about the frequency of your visits to the home and the potential conflict of interest in your role as Oliver's classroom teacher." Brooke felt the words land in her stomach like stones dropped into still water. "There is no conflict of interest. The visits were arranged through the school. They're documented." "They were arranged informally, Brooke. The documentation is limited." Mrs. Ellis removed her glasses and set them on the desk. "I'm not questioning your intentions, but the perception matters. And right now, the perception is that you have a personal relationship with the family that extends beyond your professional duties. Oliver was non-verbal for 6 months. He's talking now, he's drawing. He ate a full meal last week for the first time since—" "I know, and that progress is remarkable. But I have a duty to all the families in this school, and if one parent feels that a teacher's judgment may be compromised, I have to act." She paused. "I'm reassigning Oliver's pastoral support to Mrs. Chen, effective immediately. You'll continue as the class teacher, but the one-to-one work with Oliver stops." The room went very still. Brooke opened her mouth, closed it. Her hands found each other in her lap, fingers twisting, searching for something to fold. "I understand," she said. She didn't understand at all. The change was immediate. Within 3 days, Oliver stopped answering questions in class. He moved his chair back to the window. During art time, he sat with his hands flat on the table, pencils untouched, eyes fixed on the grey November sky as if looking for something that had been taken. Mrs. Chen tried. She was a good teacher, patient, experienced, kind in a steady, professional way. She read him stories, offered choices, used every technique in the handbook. Oliver didn't respond. By the end of the first week, he'd pushed another child during playtime. Not hard. No one was hurt. But the shock of it rippled through the staff room like a tremor. Oliver Crawford, the boy who hadn't moved for months, had shoved Tommy Parker away from the book corner with both hands, and then stood there shaking, his face red, his fists clenched at his sides. Brooke heard about it from across the room. She was marking worksheets at her desk and felt the news hit her body before her brain processed the words. A cold wave, a tightening in her chest. She wanted to go to him. Every instinct in her said, "Go." She stayed at her desk. That night, she sat on the floor of her cottage with a square of blue paper and folded bird after bird after bird until the kitchen table was covered. Her phone rang twice. Clara, probably sensing trouble through some best friend radar that defied explanation. Brooke didn't answer. She bit her lip until it hurt. Anthony received the behavioral report on a Friday afternoon. He read it standing up in his office in London, with the city spread grey and indifferent beyond the glass. The words were clinical. Regression in social engagement, incident of physical aggression, recommended reassessment of support strategy. He closed the report, set it on his desk, moved his pen to the left side, then the right, then back to the left. Oliver was slipping. Again. He cancelled his 3 o'clock meeting, then his 4 o'clock, then everything for the rest of the day. His assistant knew better than to ask questions when Anthony Crawford cleared his schedule with that particular expression, the one that looked calm on the surface, but carried the pressure of something about to fracture. He drove to the school himself. No driver, no appointment. He walked into the main office in his suit and overcoat and asked to speak with Miss Dawson. Mr. Crawford, Miss Dawson is no longer assigned to—" "I know. I'd like to speak with her anyway." He found her in the classroom after hours, stacking chairs. She was barefoot again. She always took her shoes off when she thought no one was watching. "I need your help," he said. No preamble. No formality. Just 5 words spoken by a man who looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like he didn't have a plan. "The school won't let me—" "Not here. At the house. A private arrangement, formal contract, documented, regulated, everything above board. I'll have my solicitor draft it by Monday." She set down the chair she was holding. "You want me to be his private tutor. I want my nephew to stop disappearing." His voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. A fracture so fine that if she hadn't been watching his face, she would have missed it. But Brooke Dawson was someone who noticed what others hid. She saw the crack. And behind it, a man who had lost his sister, inherited her son, rebuilt his entire life around that boy, and was now standing in a primary school classroom, asking a 29-year-old teacher in bare feet to save what he couldn't save alone. "Let me think about it," she said. He nodded once, turned, walked out. She stood among the small chairs and thought about Oliver's drawing, 3 figures, holding hands, and the word he'd chosen, not wish, not dream, not pretend. Family. She reached for her phone. Clara arrived at Brooke's cottage without calling first. That was never a good sign. She stood on the doorstep with a bottle of wine in one hand, and an expression that sat somewhere between concern and the kind of determination people bring to difficult conversations they've been rehearsing in the car. Her coat was still buttoned. She hadn't even taken the time to fix her scarf, which hung at an angle that would normally drive her mad. "We need to talk," she said. "Hello to you too." Brooke. The single word carried enough weight to fill the hallway. Brooke stepped aside and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table still covered in origami birds from earlier that week, which Brooke swept to one side with the casual embarrassment of someone caught in a habit they can't explain. Clara didn't comment on the birds. She opened the wine, poured 2 glasses, and sat with her hands wrapped around hers, like it was a mug of tea on a cold day. "You're leaving the school." "I'm considering a private tutoring position." "For the Crawford boy?" "For Oliver." "Yes." Clara took a long sip, set the glass down. Her fingernail tapped the stem twice, a habit she'd had since university, a tiny metronome that measured how carefully she was choosing her next words. "I watched you do this before. The shelter in Camden. You gave everything to those kids, and when it shut down you couldn't get out of bed for a week. You cried so hard you gave yourself a migraine. This is different. How? You're walking into someone else's world again. Their house, their rules, their money. And when it falls apart, because these things do fall apart, Brooke, you'll be the one standing outside with nothing." Brooke's jaw tightened. She picked up a square of paper from the table and began folding without looking at it. Valley fold, mountain fold. Her fingers moved on instinct. "It won't fall apart." "You don't know that." "I know that boy needs me." Clara leaned forward. "Which boy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Brooke's hands stopped mid-fold. She looked at Clara, really looked, and saw not accusation but fear. The fear of a friend who had picked up the pieces before and wasn't sure she had the strength to do it again. "I'm not doing this because of Anthony Crawford," Brooke said. Her voice was quiet, steady, almost convincing. Clara held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she exhaled, sat back, and drank her wine. "Just promise me something." "What?" "That you'll keep enough of yourself outside those gates that you still exist if this ends." Brooke nodded. She finished the origami fold without realizing what she'd made. When she looked down, a small paper crane sat in her palm, perfect and still. She set it on the table between them. Neither of them mentioned it. The next morning, Brooke drove to her mother's house. Helen Dawson lived in a narrow stone cottage 20 minutes from the village, with a garden that grew more wildflowers than vegetables, and a front door that hadn't been locked in 15 years. She was in the kitchen when Brooke arrived, standing at the counter with a cup of tea and the morning crossword, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She didn't look up when Brooke walked in. just poured a second cup and slid it across the counter. "Sit down. You look like you haven't slept." Brooke sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup and told her mother everything: the school's decision, Anthony's offer, Clara's warnings, the contract that was already being drafted. She talked for 10 minutes without stopping, the words tumbling out in the messy, breathless way they only did when she was with someone who wouldn't judge the disorder. Helen listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't nod along or make reassuring sounds. She just listened, the way she always had, with her whole body turned toward her daughter, her eyes steady, her silence a kind of holding. When Brooke finished, Helen set down her crossword pen. "Are you doing this for the boy, for him, or for yourself?" Brooke opened her mouth. Nothing came. The question sat inside her chest like a key, trying every lock. For Oliver, yes, absolutely. The boy needed stability, needed someone who understood his language of silence and paper birds and stories about animals. That was true. For Anthony, she couldn't say no to that either, not honestly. Not with the memory of his voice cracking in that classroom still echoing in her ears, or the way he'd looked at her on the veranda as the sun turned everything gold, or the feeling of almost that had kept her awake for 3 nights running. For herself, and that was the one that frightened her most. Because if she was honest, truly honest, the mansion didn't just feel like Oliver's world anymore. It felt like somewhere she could belong. And wanting to belong somewhere that wasn't hers was exactly the kind of need that had broken her before. "I don't know," she said. Helen reached across the counter and covered Brooke's hand with her own. Her palm was warm, dry, and smelled faintly of the lavender soap she'd used for as long as Brooke could remember. "Then pay attention until you do." Brooke signed the contract on a Wednesday. Anthony's solicitor had been thorough. 23 pages of terms, schedules, responsibilities, and boundaries. Professional relationship. Defined hours. Monthly reviews. Everything structured, documented, and legally sound. Anthony had insisted on that. He needed the framework. Without it, everything felt like something that could slide out of his grip. The first week as Oliver's private tutor settled into place with surprising ease. Mornings in the library, reading and drawing, afternoons in the garden when the weather held, or in the conservatory when it didn't. Oliver responded immediately, not with a dramatic transformation, but with the slow, steady unclenching of a child who had been holding his breath and had finally been told he could let it go. He started finishing sentences, asking questions, using colors in his drawings that weren't grey or brown, a red bird, a yellow sun, a green field so vivid it practically hummed. George noticed first. "The boy's got his spark back," he told Margaret over the garden wall, loud enough for the entire estate to hear. "Told you she was the one." "You told me nothing of the sort," Margaret said, not looking up from the herbs she was cutting. "You said she had kind eyes and good posture. That's not the same thing." "It's close enough." Mrs. Whitmore said nothing, but she began setting 3 places for dinner instead of 2, and when Brooke tried to protest that she should eat separately, the older woman simply looked at her with an expression that closed the discussion before it began. "You sit where I put you," Mrs. Whitmore said, "and tonight it's Margaret's shepherd's pie, so I suggest you sit quickly." The dinners changed everything. Anthony started coming home earlier. Not dramatically. He didn't announce it, didn't rearrange meetings with fanfare. He simply began appearing at 6:30 instead of 8, then at 6, then at 1:45. Always with a reason, a document to review, a call he could take from home, a question about Oliver's progress that could have waited until morning but somehow couldn't. He'd sit at the head of the table with his shirt collar loosened and his sleeves rolled, listening to Oliver describe the day's lessons while Brooke translated the parts that got lost in the boy's excitement. Their eyes would meet over the table. Quick, careful, loaded with things neither of them said. Mrs. Whitmore and Margaret exchanged glances so often they'd developed an entire silent vocabulary. A raised eyebrow from Mrs. Whitmore meant, "Did you see that?" A slight tilt of Margaret's head meant, "I saw." A shared look toward the ceiling meant, "Lord, give me patience with these two." George, who possessed the subtlety of a brass band, walked into the kitchen one evening and announced to no one in particular, "This house hasn't felt this alive since before Sarah passed, and if those two don't sort themselves out soon, I'm going to lock them in the greenhouse until they do." Margaret threw a dish towel at his head, but no one disagreed. It was the corridors that undid them. The mansion was old enough that its hallways were built for a different century, narrower than modern houses, with stone floors that echoed and door frames that forced two people to turn sideways if they happened to meet. And they happened to meet constantly. Tuesday evening. Brooke was carrying a stack of Oliver's drawings to the library. Anthony was coming out of the kitchen with a glass of water. They met at the turn where the hallway narrowed beside the grandfather clock. She stepped left. He stepped the same way. She stepped right. He mirrored her again. "Sorry," she said. "Go ahead." He pressed himself against the wall to let her pass. The space was tight enough that her arm brushed his chest as she moved through. The contact lasted less than a second. But she felt the warmth of him through his shirt, felt the slight catch in his breathing, and her grip on the drawings tightened hard enough to crease the top sheet. She kept walking. Didn't look back. He stood in the hallway for 4 full seconds after she'd gone, his hand flat against the wall where he'd pressed himself, as if the stone could cool whatever was burning under his skin. These moments accumulated like water behind a dam. Thursday morning. She was in the garden teaching Oliver to fold a paper boat. Anthony came outside to ask about the week's schedule. He crouched beside them to see the boat, and his knee pressed against hers. Neither moved. The conversation continued as if nothing had happened, but Brooke's voice dropped half a register, and she lost her place in the folding instructions twice. Friday afternoon. She was reaching for a book on a high shelf in the library. He appeared behind her and reached over her, close enough that his chin was nearly at her temple, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body like a wall of warm air. He pulled the book down and handed it to her without stepping back immediately. For a moment she was between him and the bookshelf, breathing in the scent of cedar and clean cotton. "Thank you," she managed. "Of course." His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man running calculations on how long he could stay that close before something gave way. He stepped back. Saturday evening. Oliver had a cold and went to bed early, wrapped in blankets with Margaret's chicken soup in his stomach and Mrs. Whitmore's hand on his forehead. The house went quiet. Brooke should have gone home. Her coat was by the door, her shoes, somewhere probably under the hall table, since she'd kicked them off 3 hours ago. She could have left. Instead, she walked into the garden. The night was clear and cold. December had settled over the Cotswolds with the kind of chill that made the stars look sharper, as if the cold air had polished them. The garden was silvered in moonlight, the roses dormant, their bare branches reaching upward like thin fingers. George's beloved plants were wrapped in burlap for winter, and the fountain had been drained, its stone bowl holding nothing but shadows. She was collecting origami figures from the grass, boats and cranes that Oliver had left scattered during the afternoon, when she heard the kitchen door close behind her. Anthony walked toward her carrying 2 cups. Steam rose from them in thin curls that dissolved into the night air. "Mrs. Whitmore's influence," he said, handing her one. "She's convinced that tea solves everything. I've started believing her." Brooke wrapped her hands around the cup. The warmth bled into her fingers, up her wrists, into the cold ache that the December air had planted in her bones. They sat on the stone bench between the rose beds. The bench was cold through her clothes. She didn't mind. Something about the sharpness of it felt necessary, like it was keeping her anchored to the physical world when everything else was pulling her somewhere harder to navigate. They talked about Oliver's progress, about the names George had given to every plant in the garden: Reginald, Lady Margaret, Sir Humphrey the rosemary bush. About the time Oliver had asked Margaret if frogs could eat shepherd's pie, and Margaret had answered with such seriousness that George had to leave the room to laugh. Then Brooke said something she hadn't planned. "I've never seen anyone love the way you love that boy." Anthony went still. Not frozen. Still. The way the air goes still before weather changes. His cup stopped halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the dark garden. The silence stretched between them, 1 second, 2, 3, and Brooke felt the weight of it in her chest, felt the night close in around the bench, as if the garden itself was listening. When he turned to face her, his expression had changed. The composure was gone. The careful control, the measured distance, the walls he'd built with schedules and contracts and formal language, all of it had fallen away, and what was underneath was raw and open and terrifying in its honesty. He set his cup on the bench beside him, slowly, deliberately. The way he did everything when his mind had already decided and his body was catching up. His hand rose to the back of her neck. His fingers were warm from the cup, and she felt each one individually. The press of his thumb behind her ear, the curl of his fingers into her hair, the gentle, firm pull that brought her face toward his. She had time to notice the way his breath came uneven, the way his jaw was clenched as if this was costing him something immense, the way his eyes stayed open until the last possible second. Then he kissed her. It started carefully, a press of lips, tentative, almost a question. But the answer came fast, her hand finding his collar, her body leaning into him, and the careful part ended. He pulled her closer, one arm around her waist, drawing her onto his lap with a sureness that surprised them both. She fit against him as if she'd always been meant to be there, her knees on either side of his hips, his arms locked around her. His hands moved up her back, pressed, held. She could feel the tension in his fingers, the controlled strength of a man who was restraining himself, while simultaneously pulling her closer. Her own hands gripped the front of his shirt, twisting the fabric, holding on. The kisses came without pause, deep, slow, each one longer than the last. His mouth moved to her jaw, her neck, the space just below her ear where her pulse was hammering, and she made a sound that was barely a breath, quiet, involuntary, the kind of sound that escapes when every defense has been dismantled. He pressed his forehead against hers. His chest rose and fell in heavy, uneven waves. His thumb traced her lower lip, slow, deliberate, the way someone memorizes something they're afraid of losing. She closed her eyes. His hand was trembling. She could feel it against her mouth. They stayed like that, foreheads touching, breath mingling. The cold night pressed against their backs, but neither felt it. His arms didn't loosen, her hands didn't let go of his shirt. Minutes passed, or hours. The difference didn't matter. When they finally separated, Brooke's entire body was vibrating, a low, constant hum that lived in her bones and her bloodstream and the base of her throat. She stood from the bench on legs that didn't feel entirely reliable and looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had just broken every rule he'd set for himself and wasn't sure whether to be terrified or grateful. She picked up her origami figures from the grass, walked through the house, found her shoes under the hall table, put them on. Her hands were still shaking when she started the car. She drove home with the windows down, the frozen air hitting her face, her lips still burning, and the absolute certainty that no contract, no professional boundary, no carefully worded agreement could protect her from what she felt for Anthony Crawford. It was too late for protection. It had been too late for weeks. George had spent 3 days preparing the garden for the dinner. He'd strung lights between the oak trees, not the cheap plastic kind, but warm amber bulbs that cast everything in the color of candlelight. He'd trimmed the hedges into shapes that were meant to be geometric, but ended up looking, in his own words, abstract and distinguished. Margaret had polished every piece of outdoor silverware the house owned and arranged the long table beneath the pergola with white linen, crystal glasses, and small arrangements of winter jasmine that filled the cold evening air with something sweet and almost wild. It was Anthony's annual dinner for business partners and associates. 12 guests, formal dress, the kind of evening where conversations were polished before they were spoken, and every handshake had a second meaning. Anthony moved through it with practiced ease, confident, measured, his dark suit sharp against the garden lights, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be charming without being open. Brooke was there because Oliver had asked, not because of the dinner, not because of Anthony. Oliver had stood in the library that afternoon, gripping the edge of his drawing table, and said in the small, serious voice that still cost him effort, "I don't want to be alone with all those people." She'd looked at Anthony. He'd looked at her. Neither had mentioned the kiss. Neither had mentioned the night on the bench or the week that followed, a week of careful distances, charged silences, and an unspoken agreement that whatever had happened in the garden was too large to discuss and too real to ignore. "Of course I'll stay," she'd said. To Oliver. Only to Oliver. She wore a dark green dress, simple, fitted at the waist, nothing that demanded attention. But Anthony noticed it the moment she walked into the garden. He was mid-conversation with a client from Edinburgh when she appeared through the kitchen door with Oliver's hand in hers, and his sentence lost its ending. Just for a second. The client didn't notice. But Mrs. Whitmore, standing by the drinks table, did. The evening moved smoothly. Oliver stayed close to Brooke for the first hour, then drifted toward George, who was telling a group of bemused investors about the emotional intelligence of his rose bushes. Margaret circulated with trays of food, each dish a small masterpiece. The guests drank good wine and talked about markets and mergers and holiday plans. Brooke kept to the edges. She was good at that, observing, reading rooms, noticing who was comfortable and who was performing. She talked to a few of Anthony's colleagues, answered questions about tutoring, smiled at the right moments. She was careful not to look at Anthony too often. He was careful not to look at her at all, which, to anyone watching closely, said more than looking would have. Around 9, she excused herself to use the bathroom. The house was quiet inside, a relief after the noise of the garden. She walked through the hallway, past the grandfather clock, past the library where she'd read to Oliver 100 times, and felt the familiar warmth of belonging settle around her like a coat she hadn't earned. On the way back, she paused in the conservatory to straighten her hair. The glass walls looked out onto the garden, and from here she could see the table, the lights, the guests. Anthony was standing near the pergola, talking to 2 men in grey suits. She was about to step outside when she heard the voices. 2 women. Just around the column near the kitchen entrance, close enough that every word carried through the open door. "Honestly, it's transparent." The voice was smooth, confident. The kind of voice that knew it was being listened to. He told Richard himself, said the only reason the girl is still here is because the boy needs a mother figure, someone to keep the child stable so he can focus on the business. A pause. Then the second voice, lower. "That's cold. That's Anthony Crawford. He doesn't do anything without a reason. She's useful. The moment she stops being useful, she'll be gone. Same as the last 3 nannies." Brooke's hand was on the door handle. She couldn't move. "Poor thing probably thinks it's real," the first woman continued. Her tone was careful, not loud but placed. Each word aimed like a dart thrown at a board she couldn't see. "She's young enough to believe it, I suppose." The second woman murmured something Brooke couldn't catch. Then they both laughed, short, contained, a sound that cut through the evening air like glass breaking on stone. Brooke's fingers released the handle. Her chest felt hollow, carved out, as if someone had reached inside and removed something she hadn't known was there until it was gone. The woman's words replayed in her head. Useful, mother figure, the moment she stops, each one driving deeper into the fear she'd been carrying since the beginning. The fear that she was filling a role, that what felt like belonging was just convenience dressed in kindness. She walked through the house on legs that moved without instructions, found Oliver near the dessert table, his face smeared with chocolate. She crouched down, kissed his forehead, and held his face between her hands for a moment that lasted longer than she intended. "Good night, sweetheart. You're leaving. I have to go, but I'll see you soon." She didn't look for Anthony. She picked up her bag from the hallway, slipped on her shoes, and walked out the front door into the dark. The gravel crunched under her feet. The car started. The gate opened. She drove home with her hands locked on the wheel, and her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall until she was inside her cottage with the door closed and the lights off and the silence pressing against her like something physical. Then she cried. Not the quiet kind, the kind that bends the body in half. Oliver stopped eating on the second day, not dramatically. He didn't push his plate away or refuse to sit at the table. He simply moved the food around with his fork, building small walls out of peas and mashed potato, then dismantling them with a precision that made Margaret's chest ache. He ate 3 bites. 4, if she counted the one he held in his mouth for a minute, before quietly spitting it into his napkin. By the 3rd day, the silence had returned. Not complete. He still answered direct questions with a nod or a shake of his head, but the words he'd fought so hard to find were gone again. swallowed back into whatever dark, quiet place he'd built inside himself after the accident. He sat by the window in the library, his hands flat on the table, his pencils untouched. Mrs. Whitmore watched from the doorway and felt the weight of recognition. She'd seen this before. She'd seen it when Sarah died, when the house filled with flowers and silence, and a boy who stopped believing the world was safe. She'd seen it in Anthony's face, the same frozen composure, the same refusal to break, the same slow retreat behind walls that looked like strength but were really just fear in a well-pressed suit. And she'd seen what had happened at the dinner. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 40 years in that house. She knew every corner, every echo, every line of sight from every window. She'd been collecting glasses near the kitchen entrance when she heard the woman's voice. Smooth, deliberate, carrying a lie so precisely aimed that it could only have been designed to wound. She hadn't intervened. Not then. Some cruelties needed to land before they could be addressed, and Mrs. Whitmore had learned long ago that the truth was more powerful when it arrived after the damage, not before. People listened harder when they were already hurting. She found Anthony in his study on the third evening. He was sitting at his desk with his phone face down and a glass of water he hadn't touched. The room smelled of old leather and the cedar candle Margaret had placed on the shelf months ago, back when she'd decided the study was too cold and needed warmth whether Anthony wanted it or not. "She hasn't responded to any of my messages," he said without looking up. "She sent one text, said she needs time." Mrs. Whitmore closed the door behind her. "Sit down, Anthony." He looked up. She never used his first name unless the situation required it. He sat straighter. "At the dinner," she said, "there was a woman near the kitchen entrance, tall, dark hair. She was speaking to another guest, deliberately within earshot of Brooke." His jaw tightened. "What did she say?" Mrs. Whitmore told him. Every word, exactly as she'd heard them. She didn't soften the language or cushion the blow. That wasn't her way. Anthony's face didn't change while she spoke, but his hand found the edge of the desk and gripped it, and the tendons in his wrist stood out like cables pulled taut. When she finished, the study was silent. "It's a lie," he said. "I know. I never said any of that to anyone. I know that too." He stood. The chair scraped against the floor. He walked to the window, then back, then to the window again. His hand went to his watch. Turning, and Mrs. Whitmore could see in the set of his shoulders something she hadn't seen since the night Sarah died. Fear. Not the controlled kind he wore like armor. Real fear. The kind that makes hands shake and breath come short, and grown men stand in the middle of a room without knowing which direction to move. She believed it, he said. She heard that, and she believed it. Can you blame her? That woman aimed for every doubt Brooke already carries. She didn't need to be convincing. She just needed to be cruel. Anthony pressed both hands flat on the desk, lowered his head, breathed. "What do I do?" Eleanor Whitmore looked at the man she'd raised alongside his sister, the boy who'd hidden behind Sarah's legs at 5, the teenager who'd carried his grief like a briefcase, the man who had reorganized his entire life around a 6-year-old and never once admitted he was drowning. "You go to her," she said, "and you tell her the truth. Not the version you've rehearsed in your head, the real one." He drove himself, no preparation, no planned words. He didn't bring flowers. The thought crossed his mind, and he dismissed it. Brooke would see through that in a second. Helen Dawson's cottage appeared at the end of a lane lit only by a single street lamp. Brooke's car was in the drive. A light was on in the kitchen. He knocked. Helen opened the door. She looked at him the way only a mother can look at a man standing on her doorstep at 8 in the evening, measuring him, reading him, deciding in 3 seconds what would have taken anyone else an hour. She stepped aside without a word. Brooke was on the back porch, wrapped in a cardigan that was too large for her, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes red in a way that no amount of cold air could explain. When she saw him, her whole body stiffened. "I don't want to hear it." "I know." He stopped at the edge of the porch, hands at his sides, no watch to adjust, nothing to arrange or control, just a man standing in the cold, with nothing between himself and the truth. "Nothing you heard is real, not a word, and if I'd known how to say what you mean to me and to him, I would have said it a long time ago. before any of this. Her chin trembled. She pressed her lips together hard. "I'm not a role to fill, Anthony." "You were never a role." His voice broke on the last word, quietly, like something cracking deep underground. "You were the thing I didn't know I was missing until you were standing in my hallway with paint on your hands and no shoes on." She made a sound, at half laugh, half sob, that carried the entire weight of the past week. He stepped closer. She didn't pull away. He reached for her face, both hands. His thumbs brushed the tears from her cheeks with a tenderness that contradicted every hard edge she'd ever seen in him. She closed her eyes and leaned into his palms, and the resistance she'd been holding, all of it, every wall, every doubt, came apart. He kissed her forehead first, then her temple, then her mouth, softly, slowly, like an apology made of breath and warmth, and everything he'd spent months refusing to feel. She kissed him back, and this time, neither of them pulled away. Inside the kitchen, Helen Dawson set down her tea and smiled at the wall. Some answers, she thought, don't need words. The gravel sounded different when she came back. Maybe it was the morning light changing everything, or maybe it was the fact that Brooke was listening harder than she'd ever listened to anything. The crunch under her tires, the wind in the oaks, the faint bark of the dog somewhere behind the house. Every sound felt sharpened, as if the world had turned up its volume to match the pounding in her chest. She parked in her usual spot, sat for a moment. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but her stomach was doing something complicated and uncooperative. The front door opened before she reached it. Oliver stood in the entrance, not Mrs. Whitmore, not Anthony. Oliver, small, serious, wearing a jumper that was slightly too big and socks that didn't match. He was holding something in both hands, cupped together like he was carrying water he didn't want to spill. Brooke crouched down, eye level, the way she always did with him. "Hey, you." He didn't answer right away. His mouth worked for a second. The same struggle she'd seen in those early weeks, when words were enemies he hadn't yet learned to trust. Then he extended his hands and opened them. A paper bird sat on his palms. It was crooked. One wing was folded at the wrong angle, the tail was bent sideways, and the crease down the center was uneven in a way that suggested it had been folded, unfolded, and refolded several times. The paper was white, printer paper, not the colored sheets she used, and there was a small smudge of chocolate on one corner. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "I made it," Oliver said, "like you showed me." A pause. His eyes found hers. "You told me birds aren't afraid to fly." Brooke's vision blurred. She took the bird from his hands, held it against her chest. And then Oliver stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her neck with the sudden total commitment that only children are capable of. No hesitation, no holding back, just the full force of a small body pressing against hers with a grip that said, "Please don't leave again." She held him. The tears came silently. She pressed her face into his hair. He smelled of toast and soap and the garden, and let them fall where he couldn't see. Her body shook with the effort of keeping quiet, of not letting the sound escape, of holding everything she felt inside a space that was too small to contain it. Behind Oliver, standing in the hallway, Anthony watched. He'd been there since she pulled into the drive. He'd planned to meet her at the door, to say something measured and reassuring, to handle the moment with the composure he relied on like oxygen. But Oliver had been faster. Oliver had heard the car and bolted from the breakfast table with the paper bird clutched in his fist, and a determination that no adult could have matched. Now Anthony stood 10 feet away and watched the woman he loved hold the boy he'd raised, and felt something inside his chest give way. Not break, not crack, but release. Like a fist that had been clenched for years finally opening. His eyes burned. He blinked, swallowed, pressed his thumb against his watch face. Mrs. Whitmore appeared beside him. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her hand touched his elbow, brief, firm, the gesture of a woman who had held this family together through worse. And then she was gone, back to the kitchen, back to the kettle, back to the quiet work of keeping a house alive. Brooke stood with Oliver still attached to her. She looked over his head at Anthony. He looked back. No walls, no composure, No carefully constructed distance. Just a man in his own hallway, with wet eyes and a loosened collar, and the expression of someone who had stopped pretending he didn't need what was standing right in front of him. She mouthed 2 words. "I'm sorry." He shook his head, mouthed back, "Don't be." Oliver pulled away, looked up at Brooke's face and frowned. "You're crying." Happy tears. He considered this with deep seriousness. That's confusing. She laughed. It was wet and messy and real, the kind of laugh that lives right next to a sob and doesn't care about the difference. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the paper bird still pressed against her chest. "This is going on my shelf," she said. "The best spot." Oliver nodded once, satisfied. Then he took her hand and pulled her inside. George was waiting in the garden with an expression of theatrical nonchalance. "Oh, you're back," he said, as if he hadn't been watching from the kitchen window for 20 minutes. "Good. Lady Margaret's been drooping without you. The plant, not the cook. Though the cook's been a bit off as well." Margaret's voice carried from the kitchen. "I heard that, George. Meant you two, love." And just like that, the house breathed again. Oliver fell asleep at 8:30 mid-sentence, with a picture book open on his chest, and the dog curled at his feet. Anthony carried him to bed. Brooke pulled the covers up and placed the crooked paper bird on the nightstand, where Oliver could see it when he woke. They stood on either side of the small bed for a moment, looking down at the boy whose breathing had already slowed into the deep, even rhythm of someone who finally felt safe enough to surrender to sleep. Then they were alone. The garden was cold. January had stripped the last color from the landscape, leaving everything in shades of grey and silver and the dark green of the ivy that clung to the east wall. George's roses were bare stalks. The fountain was dry. The bench between the rose beds held a thin layer of frost that glittered under the outdoor lights Anthony had switched on from the kitchen. He brought no tea this time. They sat on the bench. The cold bit through their clothes immediately, but neither suggested going inside. Some conversations needed open sky. Brooke spoke first. "I almost didn't come back." "I know. Not because of what that woman said, because part of me thought she might be right." She pulled her sleeves over her hands. "I've spent my whole life reading other people, knowing what they need, knowing what to give. But I never trust that anyone sees me the same way. So I always think I'm the one doing the work and they're just letting me." Anthony didn't respond immediately. He sat with her words the way she'd taught him to sit with Oliver's silences, not rushing to fill them, not fixing, just being present. "I spent 6 months trying to be enough for that boy," he said. His voice was low, stripped of its usual polish. "I reorganized my entire company, moved to the countryside, hired the best therapists money could buy, and none of it worked. I couldn't reach him." He looked at his hands. "Then you walked in with a paper bird and no shoes on, and in 3 weeks you did what I couldn't do in 6 months. Anthony, let me finish." He turned to face her. "I told myself I admired you. Then I told myself I was grateful. Then I told myself it was just proximity, that anyone would feel this way about someone who saved the person they love most." A pause. "But I'm not a man who lies to himself for long. And the truth is that I've spent months building walls to keep you at a professional distance, and you've walked through every single one without even trying." The frost on the bench was melting where their bodies pressed against it. Brooke could feel the damp through her jeans, the cold on her skin, the warmth of him beside her, and the contrast between the two felt like the whole of this moment reduced to a sensation. "I'm terrified," she said, "of needing this, of needing you. Because if I let myself belong here and it falls apart, I don't just lose you, I lose Oliver, I lose this house. I lose Margaret and George and Mrs. Whitmore. I lose everything." He reached for her hand. His grip was firm, warm, certain. "You won't lose anything. I don't let go of the people I love." The word settled between them. Neither flinched from it. She leaned into him. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close, and they sat in the cold garden with the stars sharp above them and the house glowing behind them. And for the first time, the silence between them was the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need filling. When they went inside, neither made a decision. It happened the way water finds its path, naturally, inevitably, without force. His bedroom door closed softly behind them. The room was warm, lit only by the lamp on the bedside table, casting everything in amber. He turned to her with an expression she'd never seen, open, vulnerable, almost uncertain, as if the man who controlled empires didn't know what to do with the weight of what he felt. She touched his face, his eyes closed. What followed was slow, gentle. Two people who had spent months holding back, finally allowing themselves to be held. His hands trembled when they found her skin. Her breath caught when his mouth traced the curve of her shoulder. They moved with the care of people who understood that this wasn't just desire. It was trust made physical. He whispered her name against her collarbone. She pressed her lips to the scar above his eyebrow. Every touch was a conversation, every silence an answer. Afterward, she lay against his chest with his arm around her, listening to his heartbeat slow. The sheets smelled of cedar and warmth and him. "Stay," he murmured into her hair. She closed her eyes. She was already home. The coffee was terrible. Anthony had woken before dawn, slipped out of bed without disturbing Brooke, and gone down to the kitchen with the misguided confidence of a man who had never once operated the machine Margaret treated like a sacred altar. He'd pressed buttons, measured grounds by instinct rather than logic, poured water into what he hoped was the right compartment. The result was thin, bitter and slightly grey. He poured it anyway, set the 2 cups on a tray alongside toast that was burned on one side and cold on the other. Then he reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and pulled out the small velvet box he'd been carrying for 11 days. The ring was simple. Her single stone, not the largest the jeweler had offered, but the one that had caught the light in a way that reminded him of her eyes in the morning, when she was half awake and hadn't yet remembered to guard herself. He'd known the moment he saw it. He opened the box, looked at the ring, closed the box. Then he sat at the kitchen table and folded. His hands were not made for origami. They were broad, blunt-fingered, built for handshakes and boardroom tables. The paper resisted him. The first attempt produced something closer to a crumpled napkin than a bird. The second was better, but lopsided. The third, slower, more patient, his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, held its shape. He opened the paper bird carefully, placed the ring inside the body and folded it shut again. The bird sat on his palm, slightly uneven, one wing higher than the other, with a secret inside that changed its weight entirely. He put it on the tray beside the terrible coffee and carried everything upstairs. Brooke was awake. She was sitting up in bed with her hair tangled and his shirt hanging off one shoulder, and the sight of her stopped him in the doorway for a full 3 seconds. "You made coffee," she said. "I attempted coffee." She took a sip. Her face did something complicated. "That's very brave of you." "Margaret will never forgive me for touching her machine." Brooke smiled. Then her eyes moved to the tray, to the small paper bird sitting beside the toast. "What's that? Open it." She picked it up, turned it in her hands, ran her finger along the crease the way she did with every fold, checking the precision, feeling the intention behind it. Her brow furrowed slightly. The bird was heavier than it should have been. She unfolded the first wing, then the second. The paper opened like a flower, and the ring caught the grey morning light from the window and threw a tiny spark across the sheets. Her hand stopped. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Anthony set the tray on the bedside table, sat on the edge of the bed, took her hand, the one not holding the ring, and held it between both of his. "Stay," he said. "For good. Permanently." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, at his face, at the badly folded bird that had carried it. "You learned to fold." "I watched you. Every time. I never said anything, but I watched." Her chin trembled. She pressed her lips together, but it was no use. The tears came anyway, fast and warm, rolling down her cheeks and landing on the crumpled paper in her lap. "Yes," she whispered. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She laughed through the tears and pulled him toward her, and he kissed her with the taste of terrible coffee still on both their lips, and the morning light filling the room with the color of something beginning. A sound from the doorway. They turned. Oliver stood in the hall in his pajamas, one hand gripping the doorframe, his eyes wide. Did she say yes? Anthony looked at Brooke. She nodded, laughing, crying, completely undone. She said yes. Oliver ran. He launched himself onto the bed with the force of a small cannonball, landing between them, his arms around both their necks, his face buried in the space where their shoulders met. They held him, held each other. The paper bird lay on the sheets between them, open and empty now, its purpose fulfilled. Downstairs the kettle clicked on. Mrs. Whitmore was already awake. George planted the flowers in February while the ground was still half frozen, and everyone told him he was mad. White roses along the pergola, jasmine climbing the stone archway, lavender bordering the path from the kitchen door to the garden bench where everything had changed. He worked through rain, through frost, through Margaret shouting from the window that he'd catch pneumonia, and she wasn't making soup for a fool who didn't own a proper coat. By April, the garden was alive. The wedding was small, 30 guests, no business partners, no associates, no one who wore a smile like a strategy. Just people who had earned their place, old friends, a few family members, the school staff who'd watched the story unfold from a distance and never stopped hoping. Clara stood beside Brooke in a navy dress, holding the bouquet while Brooke's hands were occupied trying not to shake. She'd argued against being maid of honor, said she didn't deserve it after doubting everything. Brooke had looked at her and said, "You doubted because you loved me. That's exactly why I want you there." Clara had cried for 6 minutes straight, then fixed her makeup and never mentioned it again. Mrs. Whitmore had been crying since breakfast. She denied it, of course. Blamed the onions Margaret was chopping for the reception, despite the fact that Margaret hadn't started cooking until noon, and Mrs. Whitmore's eyes had been red since 7 in the morning. Margaret's cake was 3 tiers of lemon sponge with white icing and small sugar flowers that she'd spent 4 nights perfecting. She carried it to the garden table with the gravity of a woman delivering something holy. George wore a tie for the first time in 12 years. It was crooked. Nobody corrected it. Oliver was the ring bearer. He walked down the garden path in a suit that made him look like a very small, very serious businessman, carrying a velvet cushion with both hands and a concentration so fierce that several guests had to look away to keep from laughing. Brooke walked the path on her mother's arm. Helen moved slowly, not from age, from intention. She held her daughter's hand against her elbow and felt the slight tremor in Brooke's fingers and said nothing about it. The garden was warm with afternoon sun. The jasmine George had planted smelled so sweet it was almost dizzying. At the end of the path, Anthony waited. His suit was dark, his jaw was set. His hands were clasped in front of him with the stillness of a man holding himself together by will alone. Then he saw her, his composure held for approximately 4 seconds. The 5th second, his eyes filled. The 6th, he pressed his lips together hard. The 7th, he gave up entirely and let the tears fall in front of 30 people and a 6-year-old in a tiny suit. And didn't care. Helen stopped 3 steps from the arch. She turned to her daughter, took both her hands. "You didn't lose yourself, my darling," she whispered. "You found where you belong." She placed Brooke's hand in Anthony's and stepped back. The vows were simple, short, real, the kind that didn't need poetry, because the truth was enough. Oliver stood between them the entire time. Months later, on an evening in late summer, the garden was loud. Oliver, taller now, browner from the sun, with a laugh that carried across the lawn, chased the dog through George's flower beds, while George shouted threats he would never follow through on. Brooke sat on the veranda with her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, watching the chaos with a smile that reached somewhere deeper than her face. George said something about the dog having no respect for horticulture. She laughed. The sound carried through the open windows and into the house. Anthony came home early. He always did now. He stopped at the garden door, briefcase still in hand, tie already loosened. And he watched. The boy running, the dog barking, the woman sitting in the golden light with her bare feet on the stone and her hand on the life growing inside her. Mrs. Whitmore appeared beside him. She held a cup of tea. She always held a cup of tea. "This house is finally a home," she said. Simply, the way she said everything that mattered. Anthony took the cup, drank, set down his briefcase. He walked into the garden, kissed his wife's forehead, and sat beside her in the evening light. He wasn't afraid anymore. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.